So imagine spending years, maybe even decades, just trying to keep this one specific organism alive.
Right, and failing constantly.
Exactly. You fail repeatedly, you document all those failures, and eventually you just give up. You write it off as a total lost cause.
Which is pretty standard, honestly. We all have those projects.
Yeah, but then out of nowhere, you stumble on the exact foolproof secret to making that organism thrive. Like the mystery is completely solved.
Oh, wow. I mean, the logical next step, like the deeply human impulse there, is to immediately take that secret, apply it, and finally beat the thing that defeated you.
You would think so. But today, we're looking at someone who finally cracked the code, held the absolute answer in their hands, and then made this really conscious, radical decision to simply walk away.
It's actually a profound disruption of how we usually think about progress, like knowledge acquisition in general. We're so conditioned to believe that if we have the solution to a problem, we are somehow obligated to solve it.
Right. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Our mission today is to extract the hidden wisdom tucked inside a very brief, kind of mundane snapshot of a dedicated hobbyist's journey.
And this challenges that assumption at its core, using the really specific, tangible world of botany to illustrate a much bigger psychological phenomenon.
Yeah, so we are looking at a short entry from a massive ongoing blog series. It's titled Notes on Gardening. And the specific text we're analyzing today is part 990, written by an author named Ang and published on August 18th, 2026.
I mean, we really have to just pause and acknowledge the sheer volume of that archive. To be writing part 990 of any project that implies a staggering level of dedication.
It's wild.
If someone are publishing, say, one post a week, that represents nearly 20 years of continuous documentation. So we're diving into the mind of someone who doesn't just dabble.
Mm.
They meticulously track their experiments and, crucially, their failures.
Over a vast timeline, yeah. And that context is so vital because the incident we're looking at in part 990 begins with this really jarring shift in focus.
Right. Ang sets out with a very specific, large-scale goal in mind at first.
Yeah, the post details how Ang was in the middle of surveying different fish species, explicitly exploring options for outdoor ponds.
And when you're planning an outdoor pond, you are dealing in macroecosystems.
Oh, totally.
You're managing hundreds of gallons of water, factoring in unpredictable weather patterns, algae blooms driven by seasonal sunlight, not to mention local predators like raccoons or herons.
It's chaotic.
Exactly. Your mindset is vast, external, and highly reactive to these uncontrollable variables.
But then the environment just shifts abruptly. While entrenched in this macro-level planning, Ang is totally distracted by a completely different paradigm, a terrarium.
Right, going from an expansive open-air aquatic system to a miniature, enclosed, hyper-controlled indoor environment. It is a massive shift.
It's like moving from managing chaos to curating sterility.
Right.
Inside this closed glass system, Ang spots various plant species, but one in particular just locks in their attention.
Podocarpus-macrophyllus.
Yes, and the scale of that distraction is fascinating to me. It reminds me of the cognitive dissonance you'd experience if you went to an architectural firm to look at blueprints for a massive commercial building.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right, so you're there to discuss load-bearing walls, HVAC systems, thousands of tons of concrete. But while walking to the conference room, you see this tiny, intricately painted scale model of a different building on a desk.
Oh, you just get sucked in.
Exactly. Suddenly, you are completely engrossed in the millimeter-precise brushstrokes on the model's miniature window frames. You completely forget the massive skyscraper you came to discuss. It just hijacks your brain's sense of scale.
That hijacking is such a perfect illustration of how serendipitous learning actually works. We construct these really rigid, linear paths for our research, like Ang picking out pondfish.
Yeah.
But the human brain is so susceptible to pattern recognition and unresolved loops. The terrarium wasn't just a random shiny object. It contained a specific biological trigger.
Because seeing the podocarpus-macrophyllus in that miniature environment forces Ang to abandon the pond research and pull up a very old unresolved file from their own mental archive.
And Ang actually documents this internal timeline for us, which is great. The post explicitly references a massive gap in their own history.
Yeah, Ang writes, quote, "I used to explore podocarpus so many moons ago," end quote, and points directly back to part 245 of the blog.
Part 245. The gulf between Part 245 and Part 990 represents 745 distinct, documented moments of gardening experience.
It's huge. That is hundreds of successes, hundreds of dead ends, and years of horticultural maturation sitting between the initial failure with this plant and right now standing in front of the terrarium.
It really is. And to fully appreciate why this memory is so resonant for Ang, we kind of need to understand what the podocarpus-macrophyllus actually is.
Because it's an unusual candidate for a casual indoor hobbyist, right?
Very much so. It's a conifer, often called the Buddhist pine or yew plum pine. It features this very dense, dark green, needle-like foliage. Historically, it's an ancient gymnosperm.
So, a rugged survivor.
Exactly. You typically see it utilized outdoors as robust hedging or landscaping in warmer climates. Bringing it indoors at all, let alone putting it in a glass jar, is a significant geographical and environmental displacement.
Which perfectly explains Ang's past struggles. Ang is refreshingly blunt about why the project failed back in part 245.
There's that self-admitted lack of interest.
Yeah, specifically because it's a quote-unquote non-flowering plant. I mean, our brains are evolutionarily wired to seek out bright colors, right? They indicate fruit or changing seasons or just a plant thriving.
Right, a slow-growing dark green conifer simply doesn't give you that visual dopamine hit.
Exactly. But the second part of Ang's admission is where things get truly problematic from a gardening standpoint. Ang states that they, quote, simply kept it as it was and let nature take its own course.
Oof. That phrase, letting nature take its course, it's perhaps one of the most pervasive myths in the indoor gardening community. It's this romanticized concept that entirely ignores the physics of cultivation.
I'd go a step further. I'd argue it's often just a polite philosophical cloak for benign neglect.
Huh, that's a good way to put it.
I mean, think about it. When you bring an organism into a living room, place its roots in a plastic container filled with sterilized, commercially bagged soil, and put it near a pane of UV-filtered window glass, nature has absolutely left the building.
It really has. You've completely removed the plant from the complex web of soil mycorrhizae, the fluctuating wind currents that strengthen its vascular system, natural precipitation, all of it.
Right. Nature is no longer an active participant.
You are essentially playing the role of the climate, the weather, and the geological biome, yet pretending you're just a passive observer. And this is the cognitive dissonance Ang is confronting in hindsight.
The failure in Part 245 wasn't just a lack of aesthetic interest.
No, it was a fundamental refusal to acknowledge the artificiality of the environment. Ang passively observed a captive organism slowly decline and basically blamed the plant's lack of flowers rather than their own lack of intervention.
But the terrarium shatters that old narrative completely. Seeing the Buddhist pine actually thriving inside a sealed glass vessel provides Ang with an entirely new context.
It proves the plant wasn't the problem.
Exactly. So Ang does the work. They dive into the research to understand the specific environmental parameters that this ancient conifer actually needs. And this is where we arrive at the botanical paradox that makes this deep dive so compelling.
Yes, the paradox. Ang discovers that the podocarpus has two absolute, non-negotiable requirements for optimal health: constant moisture and full sunlight exposure.
Which, wait, if you understand basic plant physiology, those two requirements immediately present a severe contradiction.
They are almost mutually exclusive when dealing with a standard open-air setup.
Let's break down why that is such a lethal combination for a normal houseplant. If you place a standard potted plant on a windowsill in full, direct sunlight, that solar radiation is going to drive rapid evaporation from the soil.
Obviously.
The very energy source the plant needs to photosynthesize is simultaneously stripping the moisture from its root zone. It's a zero-sum game where the sunlight inevitably bakes the soil dry.
Right, but it's actually even more complex than just soil evaporation. This touches on the concept of transpiration. Leaves possess these microscopic pores called stomata.
Okay.
In order to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, the stomata must open. However, when they open in the presence of sunlight and dry ambient air, the plant loses its internal water vapor to the atmosphere.
Oh, wow. So it's losing water from the inside.
Exactly. This is driven by the vapor pressure deficit, which is the difference between the amount of moisture in the air and how much moisture the air can actually hold.
And in a typical home, the air's pretty dry.
Very dry. The vapor pressure deficit is high, so a plant sitting in full sun will literally bleed its internal water into your living room faster than its roots can pull it from the drying soil.
So if Ang had tried to give the plant full sun back in part 245 while just letting nature take its course in an open pot, the plant would have desiccated.
Completely. The stomata would open to capture the intense light. The internal moisture would vanish into the dry air of the room, and the conifer would turn into crispy needles.
That is the paradox. How do you feed it the intense solar radiation it demands without bleeding it dry?
This is where the physics of the terrarium transition from being merely decorative to fundamentally functional. A closed terrarium alters the entire atmospheric equation.
By sealing the environment, right?
Yes. The water that transpires from the plant's stomata and evaporates from the soil has nowhere to go. It hits the glass boundary, condenses, and returns right back to the substrate.
It eliminates the vapor pressure deficit entirely.
Precisely. The air inside the terrarium quickly reaches 100% relative humidity. Once the air is saturated, the plant can keep its stomata wide open in the full, intense sunlight,
Harvesting maximum photons for energy.
without losing any of its internal water. The terrarium essentially breaks that zero-sum game. It allows the podocarpus to exist in a state of constant moisture while simultaneously baking in full solar radiation.
It's a perfectly engineered microclimate designed to solve a very specific biological contradiction.
It really is beautiful.
And the revelation for Aang is total. I mean, after hundreds of blog posts, after a failure that lingered in the archives for years, Aang finally possesses the ultimate truth of the podocarpus. The mystery is solved.
Aang knows that combining the Buddhist pine with the thermodynamic look of a sealed glass terrarium is the definitive formula for success.
The intellectual gap has been bridged. From a narrative perspective, this is the moment where the hero takes their newly forged weapon, slays the dragon, and builds the terrarium.
Yet Aang's final verdict is a complete subversion of that expectation. Armed with the absolute certainty of how to succeed, Aang writes, quote, "Unless I get into terrariums, which I am not, we probably won't revisit this plant species again."
That decision is just breathtaking in its clarity. Aang doesn't buy a glass missile. Aang doesn't order a podocarpus. Aang simply acknowledges the solution, sets the file back down, and closes the drawer.
It demonstrates a highly evolved level of self-awareness. It touches on an issue that plagues many dedicated learners and hobbyists, which we might call the burden of capability, or, the trap of toxic productivity.
Oh, that is so true.
In our current culture, there is an immense pressure to monetize, optimize, or execute every piece of knowledge we acquire. If you learn how to code, you're expected to build an app. If you understand how a complex plant functions, you're expected to cultivate it.
But Aang explicitly severs that link between understanding a system and being obligated to operate it.
Exactly.
It's the realization that just because you have the instruction manual, you are not forced to assemble the furniture. Aang understands the plant. Aang understands the terrarium. But more importantly, Aang understands Aang.
Yes. The goal was to build an outdoor pond.
Right. The goal was to manage macro-level chaos, to deal with weather and fish and vast volumes of water. The required delivery system for the podocarpus, this sterile, hyper-controlled miniature glass box, fundamentally misaligns with the larger objectives of Aang's current life.
And think about the maturity required to draw that boundary. Many people fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy, especially when dealing with a past failure.
Oh, for sure. Because Aang failed at this plan in part 245, there would be this massive psychological temptation to build the terrarium just to prove to themselves or their readers that they could finally conquer it.
They'd force themselves to adopt a micro-hobby they don't even like, just to erase a past mistake.
It's like finally figuring out the exact dietary requirements, the perfect thermal gradients, and the precise humidity levels needed to keep a highly exotic, incredibly demanding reptile alive.
Okay, another great analogy.
You read all the veterinary textbooks, you understand the biology perfectly, and you respect the animal deeply. But in that exact same moment of complete understanding, you look at your living room and realize that building an 8-foot, climate-controlled, neon-lit enclosure would completely dominate your home.
You'd have to live around it.
Right. You can appreciate the complexity of the animal without wanting to live inside its required ecosystem. You can enjoy seeing it at the zoo while confidently saying, I am not a reptile person.
And Aang is saying, I am an outdoor pond person right now. I am not a terrarium person.
The ability to separate intellectual curiosity from behavioral obligation is honestly a superpower. It allows you to explore any rabbit hole without the fear that you'll be trapped there by your own discoveries.
Which brings us back to why Aang's detour from fish ponds to miniature glass ecosystems actually matters to us. This brief blog entry is an incredibly dense masterclass in how to process our own educational journeys. We started with the disruption of scale, moving from the massive, chaotic outdoors to the tightly controlled indoor environment.
Yeah, and that serendipitous visual trigger, forced a confrontation with a past failure, one that was previously just dismissed with the lazy excuse of letting nature take its course.
And that confrontation led to genuine scientific inquiry. We moved past the superficial desire for flowering plants and dug into the actual biological mechanics, uncovering the intense paradox of requiring both full sun and constant moisture.
And understanding how a closed thermodynamic system solves that vapor pressure deficit.
Right.
And having climbed that intellectual mountain, having achieved absolute clarity, we arrive at the most crucial lesson of all, the liberation of walking away. The realization that understanding a system does not mandate participation in it.
You can circle back to a past failure, not to conquer it, but simply to understand why the failure occurred, allowing you to close the book with peace of mind.
It totally redefines what success looks like in a learning journey.
It really does. Sometimes success isn't mastery of the skill. Sometimes success is correctly identifying that the necessary environment for the skill just does not belong in your life.
So, as you navigate your own projects, your own hobbies, and your own archives of past attempts, we want you to consider the non-flowering ideas in your life that you have quietly abandoned.
The ones you wrote off.
Right. The projects you told yourself you were just letting take their course. Did those ideas actually fail because they lacked merit or because you lacked interest? Or did they fail simply because you were trying to force them to survive in the wrong atmosphere?
It's a great question.
Perhaps they required a level of constant, specific cultivation that you just couldn't provide at the time.
Yeah.
And if you do manage to figure out the exact environment they need to finally thrive, well, the most important question isn't whether you can build that terrarium. The question is, does that terrarium actually fit the life you are trying to build?